Hi, it's Sharon from SharonTheReader.com. It's been a little while from I've been on, and some people have asked, why am I not doing different people every week? The fact is, there are people that I will be in contact with perhaps every week, but they may not be people that you know. They can be people that I know. They can be people that other people need to hear from because they're family or something like that. Okay? And that's why I don't put out content unless I have something that's for everyone, if that makes sense. So there's a few announcements I'm going to say, that being one of them. You don't need to hear some of the things I hear because they're not for other people's ears. They're also for other people who do need to hear them. And they're people who have passed on, who are not celebrities, who are just ordinary people. So I just want to make that clear as to why there is gaps between the content that I put out. So when I do give you something, it is meant for everyone who wants to listen to it. The other thing that is a little announcement, and it's actually someone on YouTube who I've never met, never heard of, fell over by accident, and her name is, or if you want to tune in, she does, I think, a monthly podcast on general psychic readings. And it is Peaceful Oracle. Now, I accidentally fell over this girl. Just literally fell over her, and I was blown away by the content of what she had to say for my particular star sign for the month, because what she was saying was what had happened in the past, the very recent past, what was happening now, and what was going to happen in the future. And of all of and I'm not putting any other readers down here. You know, I would say all the readers that are on YouTube, they do it their way. But for me, I find this girl really special. I thought she really had a really great gift, and she really did get to me. So if you want to check her out, it's Peaceful Oracle. Okay? Right, now down to the stuff that we're going to talk about. And it came in a strange way because I didn't get who it was at first. And the person just said, "Hi, it's me, Marvin." And I thought, Marvin. So I wasn't really getting it. Embarrassingly so. And he said, "It's Marvin Gaye." He said, I'm just looking at notes, you know I always do. "I wrote and performed a few of your favourite songs." And I thought, yes, you did. Now, I never saw Marvin Gaye. I never saw a photograph of him. I never saw him in concert. I don't have any of his concerts. Believe it or not, I don't have his CDs because he's one of those people who you hear sexual healing and you go, oh, great song, and things like that. But the song he was talking about was "I Heard It Through the Grapevine." He said that was the song, he says, that you really, really liked. For a reason that you know, he says, and the thing is, he says, it wasn't just you heard it through the grapevine. Unfortunately, you had to see it as well. And I knew exactly what he was talking about. He seemed round about 25 years of age. He looked very young, very handsome, I have to say. Quite spruced, in his clothes. And really softly spoken. I mean, I don't know how I would expect Marvin Gaye to actually speak, because you hear him singing and the voice that he sings with or that he sang with is very different from the voice that he actually speaks with. He's very softly spoken, he's very articulate, and he was a very gentle human being. Yeah, the first thing he said was, the world was always a very messed up place, but today it's truly moving in a seriously bad direction. Now, I'm taking it from the time when he was maybe a child, teenager, and beyond. The world wasn't working the way he seemed to think it should have been working. And he was a person who was very much into people being equal and big time believer in justice. That was one of the things that I picked up from him. It may come through on other notes I have here, but I know that that's where he was coming from. Really genuine human being, lovely person. And I said that there was probably a note about it, and there is. He said the problem was he couldn't take everything to be fair when it wasn't fair. But he says that probably is the world, and that's the way it'll always be until people make changes. So he really was big time into that quite a while ago, if you know what I mean, and he had a serious belief in that. He also said that he looked back and he knew that he questioned himself. He said, I constantly question myself. He says it was constantly for him yin and yang, good and bad. He said, I hurt a lot of people. He says, and I also hurt very easily myself. So on that scale, basically what I got was he was a person who, he certainly had his own ethical code. And I wouldn't say it was the code that everyone has. And I'm leaving the drugs out here, because I think I'm actually talking way before that. The way he was coming across to me was there was this belief in everything should be fair. People should be equal. There should be no injustice in the world. You know, surely at this stage we're way past that. And as he said, even today we're not past that. We still have things that are not fair, that are not just. And it seemed to him that time would take care of that. And when he looks back, a lot of time has passed and nothing has changed. So there was a disappointment there, and there was, without being fearful, there was a fear that the world was going in a rather bad direction, was what I got from him. When he said about the yin and the yang within himself, he said, I was a walking contradiction of myself. I was and could be exceptionally loving. I could be exceptionally caring. I could be exceptionally loyal. I could be all of those things. He says, and he says, I could be the total opposite to those things as well. And he said, if it wasn't for the fact that I could sit and look at myself, then, and only then, could I realize that there was this two-sided coin. And he says, I think everybody has it. I don't believe that there's anyone on this earth who doesn't have that. But basically, as far as he was concerned, enough people were not looking at that. It was the, you know, I'm doing well, I'm getting up in the world, things are great, things are really good, who could want for more? Oh yes, I want that. And it was a constant drive to the top, wherever the top happens to be. And that was one of the things that he was very clear about. He said, a lot of my music, he says, was to fill a need at that point, to get on to the next step on the ladder. So he really did want to be successful. But his success was kind of strange because you can get pop groups and they will do fairly well for themselves. But his interpretation of his music was that it basically was more than just music. It was art he was producing. He wanted something that would last the pace of time, that wasn't a fad, that would go on long after he was gone, and he wasn't thinking of anything like an early death. And to be honest with you, I think he achieved that, because the second I hear a Marvin Gaye song, I know exactly who it is. I know exactly what he's talking about. And so I think, truthfully, he really did manage to achieve what he set out to achieve. He then started talking about his drug use. And he said one of the things about him was, he says, I didn't cope well with things at all. He says there are people and they can cope very well and they can balance things. He said, I really lacked that. And that was one of the things that drugs helped him with. He said, I knew I wanted to talk to you before I came through, because you have always said that addiction kills the pain. And God, did I need that pain killed? But he said the next morning the pain was there again. So I believe that that would be very true of any addict. Is yes, and I have always said this, and he would be quite right there. I would say an addict of any type, that be alcohol, gambling, drugs, whatever, yes, it does soothe the pain, but what happens is you start chasing the thing that kills the pain until it becomes the problem, and it hasn't killed the pain at all. You now are a prisoner to the thing that's supposed to take the pain away. So for some reason, I don't know where he got that, but he seemed to be very well aware of my opinion of addictions. And he said he, without a doubt, was an addict. He said he didn't start out an addict. He says no one does. He says I started out smoking marijuana. He said I probably broke every rule. He says that was my personality. And listening to him, I could see that it would be his personality. And not in a nasty way, but it was like, don't confine me, and I will not take orders from anyone. If it's going to be done, it's going to be done my way. I don't want to tread on your toes, but it will be done my way. So with that sort of an attitude, that's how he really went into the business, stayed in the business, and, worked, got on, and I think was a very successful songwriter and vocalist. I mean, Marvin Gaye did not lack anything, and he certainly, didn't lack it in the content that he put out, because I think everybody has slow danced to one of his songs. So he was very interesting in that respect. Also, one of the things that he made very clear was that he was actually a very religious person, which doesn't fit with the drugs and the things that we hear about him. It's way off the beaten track to think that the drug addict Marvin Gaye can also be the Marvin Gaye who was a very religious, or maybe I should say spiritual person. He had a very deep belief in God. And he said an interesting thing. He said, I had a wonderful childhood Isn't that what everyone says? And then he said, I don't lie. I had the childhood from hell. I stayed alone a lot, and I liked being alone. He says, for a large part of my life, he says, I would honestly say I was always a loner. So it was kind of, again, here we are looking at the yin and the yang. He had the childhood from hell, and he stayed alone a lot, and he liked being alone. He says, but there was also a need, he says, for people. He says, because he says, I had an ego. He says, and when I was singing, he says, the ego was right out there. And yet, the impression I got from him was that he really didn't have an ego. That in actual fact, he was probably one of the most caring people you would ever wish to encounter. That's what I mean about this constant yin-yang that he talked about, and I could see it. The more he talked, the more it became obvious that this was a guy who went into himself, evaluated himself on a very regular basis, and knew himself very, very well. Then he started talking about his father. And he said, I have no words here to describe that man. As a songwriter with all the words at hand, I didn't have a word to describe him. And there was, I wouldn't call it anger, but there was a division from the other side. Because I presume at this stage his father has certainly passed over. He didn't mention that, but, I just think for sure his dad had moved over to the other side. But there really seemed to be, even there, a division. It was like, I'm doing this. This is my way of life. I don't engage here. It would create a disturbance in my mind. So anything he was saying as the looking back. And then he said, as far as he was concerned, his father, his real father, was God. And he said, with him, I never had to be anyone other than myself. I was loved, I was accepted, and he gave me the gift of song. So there was, and that's what I mean about, I don't know whether that's religious or whether that's spiritual. I don't particularly care either, to be honest with you, but that's my opinion. To me, you're either a religious person or you're a spiritual person, or you're both, and it makes no difference. I think as long as you're living your life to the best of your ability, and you're not harming people, then you're doing the right thing. That is my personal opinion. He was a little bit harder, I think, on himself in the sense that, for whatever pain he suffered, and he certainly did, because he did show me a few things about his dad. And what I saw was not what you expect to see from a father to his son. It was violent, it was taking him down, it was belittling him. He genuinely did not seem to have any love for his son. And his son, in turn, obviously from childhood onwards, basically had no love for the father. So you could see why, maybe if you come from a background of religion, that you will turn to God. Or if you decide religion isn't the thing for you and you decide spirituality is, you'll still find a God, a belief system that is yours, that you understand. And that seemed to be what he had. He had that. And he lived by that. And he knew when he broke his own rules, and the rules would have been implemented by himself as regards his religion or his spirituality. Make of that what you will. So, yes, I can see where he said, I had the childhood from hell, because just watching the father interact with him violently, viciously, and any way that he could take him down, it was not a pretty sight. It was disgusting, to be honest with you. And I listened to this really gentle human being who, and I will go on to that later, who must have got pretty screwed up with the drug use and things like that there, that at the end of the day, he was out to prove himself. He said his mother always took care of him. When he was talking about his father, he called him his father. When he was talking about his mother, he called her his mum. And he said, my mum always took care of me. She did everything that she possibly could to keep the peace, to see that I was okay, to try and buff the way of me not getting, a whipping. And he said that the thing was, I couldn't see it as a kid, but my father hated me for it. He hated the fact that my mother put so much love on top of me as her child. So then he realized as he got older that that was something that he had over the father. He says, and I played on it. He said, and I don't mean that he was using his mother. That wasn't his way of thinking. It was, I know my mother loves me. I know she's going to make space for me. I am well aware of that. And the father just couldn't take it, because it was almost like, and this is going to sound bad, but it's not, okay? It's just a way of putting it. It was almost like he became the breadwinner. He became the person that the mother would have went to with problems. He would have became her confidant. And that meant that the father would have been left out. So he said he knew that. He says, and I really played on it. Because he says, I knew financially I could give my mother what my father couldn't give her. And I took pleasure in it. With that type of background, you can see that there was an awful lot of toxicity in the family. Maybe the rest of the kids were okay, but I think because Marvin was a pretty sensitive guy, and he really was. He was a sensitive child, you could see that. He was very sensitive as a teenager. Yes, he knew he could get women, he said that. Getting women was never a problem. Falling in love, he says, when I fell in love, he says, I really fell in love. It wasn't kind of like, it's an attraction. He says the attraction would have been there if the love wasn't there. He says, I didn't want a charm for my arm. He says, I didn't need that. I needed a woman, he says, who was there for me to love me. He says, and equally, he says, and maybe I didn't show it often enough, I loved the women that I was married to. I loved the women who played a part in my life. He said, so I never was out to degrade women. He says, that would have been the last thing in my mind. He says, I adored women. He says, but he says, I'll be honest, he says, I could have my heart broke very, very, very easily. He says, and that was frightening, because again, that was someone having power over me, the same way as his father would have had power over him. On the note about his dad and his mother, and that's me talking, not him, because he would say father and mum. The thing was, he said it was not a healthy place to be coming from, but I felt completely justified also at that point, he says, I was using a lot of drugs. A lot of drugs. I don't believe, he says, I flaunted it in front of my father. But he says there was drug dealers. And he says, I mean, I was high. He says, I was a mess at the end. I came off a tour. I was exhausted. I had been clean, and suddenly I'm back where I was to begin with. He says, it was horrible. You had to walk through it, and, every day you had to have your fix. If you didn't, you would not have got through that day. So it seriously did seem that the addiction had really, really badly taken over, which was a shame, because since he said he had been clean before that, it's a shame he put himself back in that position again, to be touring, to be doing concerts, stuff like that. I think that was sad. But then again, if you have a talent like that, then if you're not using it, what are you doing? You're shriveling up, and it's going to get to you. And the thing was, I think he said, to use his audience, or his talent to reach the audience, is maybe a better way of putting it, to put a lot of political stuff across, which is something I was completely unaware of. The songs that I remember are, as I say, the end of the evening songs, where you're dancing a slow dance with the person you want to, or whatever. But there was more. He says there was a lot of political stuff, he says there. He says there was a lot of emotional stuff there. He says there was a lot of sexual stuff there. He says least of all of them, he says, was the sexual stuff. He says there was even gospel stuff. He says, I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot, as he said, my father. And that was God. And I knew what he was talking about when he said that. So basically that's where he was coming from. To be honest with you, he's sitting in a really messed up place where he needs this constant fix. He's in the house, and I don't know whether it's his house and his parents are there, or whether it's their home and he's there, but they're all in the one house, which, when I think about it and when you see it, it's kind of like, Jesus Christ, this crowd need to get away from each other. This guy needs treatment. And you could tell he really did need treatment. What he showed me was the sweat was dripping from him. He was in what I would call the clothes we hang around the house in, and stuck in a bedroom, just basically trying to get through the morning until someone came with whatever it was he needed. So that, and the fact that his dad was jealous, and I'm just going to say the word jealous, of his son, the reaction of that was never ever going to lead to a good place. And he said, then, he says, an argument broke out. He says, and it continued, he says, for roughly 24 hours, bickering, shutting up, bickering, arguing, walking out of the room. He says it didn't stop. It had breaks, but it always came back to the same thing, the argument. He said, and he says, I was sitting, he says, with my mum, and I don't know where it was, but it seemed a room. It could have been the sitting room, I'm not sure. But the father got very aggressive, came in with a gun, and he said, that was a gun, he said, that I paid for, by the way. He says, without any warning at all, shot me. Don't think for a second that that was a sad thing. It was not sad for me. He says, I had seen enough of this world. I had seen the stench of it, and I had seen the beauty of it. And here we go again, the yin and the yang. I've never seen anyone who could switch it so quickly, the yin and the yang, as he did. But it was obviously the way that this man thought. Don't think, he says, that it was sad. It was unjust. He says, and I firmly believed in justice. And he says, at the end of this, he says, there came no justice. He says, but he says, it did end my life. So it got me out of the world that shone beautifully. He says, I remember, he says, every moment, he says, of the beauty that there was in that world. Every moment of the love that was given to me freely. Every moment of the love that I give from my heart, genuinely, to my wives, he says, to my children, he says, to my family. And obviously he was leaving his father out of that. Or, yeah, his father, that's what he would have called him. But at the end of the day, there was no, oh my gosh, you've just shot me. There was a shock of being shot, there's no doubt about that. Because to be honest with you, the way the bullet seemed to hit really knocked him completely off his feet. It was just kind of like, whoa, that is a pressure I have never felt. That is really something else. He says, but he says, and in the midst, he says, of this, he says, and it was a horrific sight. And when I saw it, it was a horrific sight. It was. A man putting his hand on his chest and the blood rushing through it. It was horrendous, believe me. But he says, I died, he says, in the arms, he says, of my brother. He says, and my brother loved me. He says, and I can think of no better way, he says, of leaving this earth to go and to meet my real father than to be leaving it in the arms, he says, of my brother, who I loved and who really always loved me. He says he was a wonderful guy. He says genuinely, he says he was a wonderful human being and he cradled me like a baby. He says, so don't think, he says, the end was bad as in, oh my God, he was robbed of his life. I lost years, that's true. He says, but having said that, he said, how long, he says, even if I had went into rehab, how long would I have continued off drugs? I'd been off them before I went back on them. I would have been back on them again. He says, so at the end of the day, he says, I'm happy, maybe not with the gunshot, certainly not coming from my father, because I wouldn't have given him that pleasure. I'm happy that I died in the arms of someone who loved me. So, complicated human being, very complicated, but I will say one thing, what astounded me with him, and I keep coming back to this yin and yang, is I don't think a lot of us actually do look at the two sides of ourselves. And he certainly did not shy away from looking at both sides. And knowing when he was actually not living up to what he wanted, what he believed in, what he wished himself to be. And I don't mean wished himself to be and couldn't be. I mean what he knew better and what he knew he was capable of. And he knew that he had let that part of himself down. So that was something that, not everybody has. Maybe it's something that may be very beneficial if we did have it, and we could be very honest about that to ourselves. You don't have to be honest about it to anyone else. I mean, I'm not saying that this guy would have been very honest about that to other people. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But from the other side, he could very seriously tell me without any qualms that looking at both sides of himself was not something that frightened him. So he was a very interesting person, and yes, I do remember those songs, and I don't think there'll ever be anyone who can do those type of songs that I'm thinking of. I'm not aware of the political ones. I'm not aware of the gospel ones. I'm really aware of what you would call the ones that everybody knows. That you hear it and you immediately go, Marvin Gaye. You know? And the one thing I'm pleased with, and I'm really, I suppose, glad, is that he left something behind him that we have today. And we'll always have it. Because I was listening to him at 19 years of age, maybe younger even. And those songs were absolutely amazing. So he left a legacy behind him. He also left a family behind him where there may have been disagreements, but there was still a lot of love. And that's what I want to share with you. These are the things that give you an insight onto other people that you may wish to have. You don't need the other conversations that I have with other people. They serve no purpose to you. This may serve a purpose. It'll certainly give you an insight onto the man. And I will say, looking at the 25-year-old Marvin Gaye, handsome. That's all I can say. A very, very handsome man. And so softly spoken. And so together. I mean, this is you could use the word drug addict. He was an addict. But I will say one thing. This man had a very sharp brain. I mean, he was highly intelligent. So, and if you take the money that he made, it's not always the poor people, that are looking for a hit. This was a guy who could afford it. Sadly, he had to have it. It was a need to get rid of the pain. Wouldn't it have been so much better if there had been no pain? Then there would have been no need. So, I hope that gives you a little bit of Marvin Gaye. I hope you enjoyed it. Some of the stuff you wouldn't have wanted to see. It wouldn't have served any purpose for you to see it, right? So take my word for it. You didn't miss out on anything there. But one of the things that I will say is his words were amazing. His love of life and his desperate despair of it, which was the coin with the two sides, was amazing to hear about. Because I was glad of one thing. Some people can go through their entire life and not see much beauty in it. He saw a lot of beauty in life. As much despair as there was with him, there was as much beauty to balance it. And I'm glad he had that. I hope this didn't disappoint, and if it did, I'm sorry. I hope it reaches someone. But I really did want to get this one out because I've had it for a few days, and it was kind of like just finding the right moment to put it together. Maybe we can actually create that better world he talked about. Maybe it's possible. Hopefully it is. And I'm just going to say the usual thing, which is take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and until soon, and I don't know who's next, but hopefully what you've got today will tide you over till the next time. And all of yous, take care, God bless, look after each other. We're all we have. Goodbye.